Welcome to True Crime Threads. Today we uncover the tragic story of a father's deadly obsession with his daughter. The Carter family seemed flawless to everyone in their small town. Stanley Carter, a skilled craftsman known for his meticulous work, was a devoted father to his teenage daughter, Rita. Stanley and his wife, Elena, often attended community events where Stanley's pride in Rita was evident. She was a straight-A student, a gifted pianist, and a compassionate volunteer at local shelters. Their house was always filled with accolades, certificates, and awards showcasing Rita's academic and extracurricular achievements. From the outside, they appeared to be the ideal family. Stanley's attachment to Rita went beyond the typical father-daughter bond. He insisted on driving her to and from school, even though Rita had a car of her own. He scrutinized her social life, carefully selecting which friends she could spend time with. Whenever Rita had a party invitation, Stanley would often volunteer to chaperone, despite her protests. He wasn't just protective, he was controlling. Every decision in Rita's life seemed to pass through him, from her choice of hobbies to her plans for the future. His love for her was apparent, but it became increasingly clear that his affection was laced with possessiveness. Elena, who had always been the more easygoing parent, started noticing changes in her husband's behavior. At first, she chalked it up to his natural desire to be involved in their daughter's life. But as time passed, she began to feel uncomfortable with how closely Stanley monitored Rita. Whenever Rita spent time with friends, Stanley would ask probing questions, often going as far as contacting the parents of her friends to confirm the details. While Elena initially thought Stanley's actions were simply signs of a concerned father, there were growing whispers from friends and neighbors who felt his behavior was becoming unhealthy. Rita, a vibrant 17-year-old, felt stifled under her father's constant watch. Though she loved him deeply, she couldn't ignore the suffocating grip he had on her life. She had dreams of going away to college, but she knew that would be an impossible goal with her father in control of nearly every aspect of her existence. Whenever she tried to assert her independence, Stanley would dismiss her wishes, claiming that he only wanted what was best for her. But to Rita, it felt more like a prison. As her senior year approached, Rita started to look into universities far away from home. She longed for a fresh start, free from the overbearing expectations of her father. But what she didn't realize was that her decision to break free would ignite a tragic chain of events that would shatter their family forever. Stanley's obsession intensified as Rita applied to colleges. She was thrilled to be accepted into a prestigious university in another state, a dream she had worked hard for. However, Stanley saw it as a direct challenge to his control over her. He argued that moving so far away was impractical and dangerous. He insisted she apply to a local school instead, claiming it was more affordable, safer, and better suited for her. Despite Rita's excitement and her plans for independence, Stanley's arguments weighed heavily on her. He presented his viewpoint as though it were the only sensible one, repeatedly reminding her that she would always have a place at home, no matter what. He even suggested she could commute to college to stay closer to family. Elena, increasingly aware of the strain on Rita and Stanley's relationship, started to question whether his behavior had crossed a line. She felt torn between supporting Rita's dreams and siding with her husband, whose actions seemed more controlling by the day. When Rita eventually received an acceptance letter from the distant university, Stanley's reaction was cold. He barely acknowledged the achievement and instead focused on undermining it. He started researching the risks of living away from home, citing alarming statistics about crime and accidents, and subtly casting doubt on Rita's decision to pursue a life outside the safety of their home. Rita, feeling the weight of her father's disapproval, tried to reason with him. She tried to explain how important it was for her to experience life on her own terms, but Stanley was relentless. He could not fathom a life where Rita was not under his watchful eye. It wasn't just about her education, it was about keeping her close, controlling her every step. Meanwhile, Elena attempted to intervene, urging Stanley to let Rita make her own choices. She tried to remind him that Rita was growing up, and it was natural for her to want some space. But Stanley dismissed her concerns, becoming more agitated with each passing day. He started spending long hours in his workshop, where he would disappear for hours, lost in his thoughts. When Elena confronted him, he told her that she was too soft on Rita, failing to understand that it was his job as a father to protect her from the outside world. Rita, in turn, began feeling more isolated. She had long dreamed of a future where she could leave the town and pursue her passions, but her father's relentless interference made that dream feel out of reach. Desperate for a solution, Rita confided in her best friend, Maya. Together, they came up with a plan for Rita to leave quietly, hoping to escape without causing a major confrontation. But Stanley's suspicion was growing, and he was already watching her every move. As the days to her planned departure neared, Stanley's behavior grew more erratic. He became fixated on every little detail of Rita's life, double-checking her schedule, questioning her about where she went, and even monitoring her phone and messages. Rita had long suspected that her father had placed a tracking device on her phone, but now she was certain. She felt trapped, unable to make a single move without him knowing about it. Her hope of escaping to college began to feel like an impossible dream. Every time she tried to make plans, Stanley would intervene, finding a way to talk her out of it, or worse, guilt her into staying. Elena, who had been growing more concerned, noticed the escalating tension between Stanley and Rita. She tried to intervene, telling Stanley that he was pushing Rita too far, but he dismissed her concerns, accusing her of being overly emotional. He couldn't understand why Elena wasn't as committed to protecting their daughter as he was. In his mind, any attempt to separate Rita from him was a betrayal. He believed that if Rita left, she would be lost to the world, and he couldn't let that happen. Rita, meanwhile, began to feel the full weight of her father's obsession. She had always known that he was protective, but this was different. He wasn't just protecting her, he was controlling her every aspect of her life. The thought of leaving felt both freeing and terrifying. Every time she thought about the future, she imagined herself being trapped by Stanley's hold on her, unable to escape. She couldn't breathe under the constant surveillance. It was more than just love, it was fear. In the middle of all this, Rita made a heartbreaking decision. She realized that if she wanted any chance of a future outside of her father's shadow, she would have to leave without telling him. There was no room for discussion, no convincing him to let go. She quietly packed a bag, planning to leave early the next morning. She wrote a note for her mother, explaining that she was going to stay with a friend for a while and would be back soon, but she knew that was a lie. The night before her departure, Stanley caught her packing. His reaction was violent. He stormed into her room, demanding to know what she was doing. When Rita tried to explain, he grabbed her arm and pulled her away from the suitcase, his voice shaking with anger. "You're not leaving me, Rita. You're not going anywhere." His grip tightened, and Rita, overwhelmed with fear, couldn't find the strength to fight him off. The reality of the situation hit her. She couldn't leave. Stanley locked her in her room, saying she wouldn't be going anywhere until she understood that she belonged with him. Elena tried to intervene, pleading with Stanley to let Rita go, but he refused. The walls of their home felt like they were closing in on Rita. When Elena discovered Rita missing from her friend's house, panic set in. Rita had been staying with Maya, trying to distance herself from the oppressive environment at home, but Elena had always trusted her daughter and never imagined something would go so terribly wrong. When she called Maya, her worst fears were confirmed. Maya hadn't heard from Rita since the previous evening. The last thing she remembered was Rita saying she was going to sneak back home in the early hours of the morning to avoid another confrontation with Stanley. Elena immediately contacted Stanley, but he claimed he hadn't seen Rita and was just as worried as she was. His calm demeanor was unsettling. Elena knew that something wasn't right. As she tried to call the police, Stanley's tone shifted. He began to make excuses, talking in circles, suggesting that Rita had simply gone off to clear her head. Elena's gut told her otherwise. Stanley's behavior had become unpredictable, and his response to Rita's disappearance only made her more suspicious. Authorities launched a statewide search, and soon it became clear that Stanley was involved. Surveillance footage from a gas station just outside town revealed Stanley's truck, with Rita visibly sitting in the passenger seat. But what made it even more disturbing was the footage from a nearby street, where a witness claimed to have seen Stanley and Rita arguing outside the vehicle. Rita appeared distressed, trying to push away from her father, but Stanley seemed insistent on forcing her into the truck. The witness described the situation as tense, but they didn't intervene, assuming it was just a father-daughter disagreement. As the search intensified, the police managed to trace the truck's route to a remote area several hours outside of town. The location was a dilapidated cabin in the woods, an old family property that Stanley had once talked about visiting to get away from it all. The authorities feared that Rita was in immediate danger. They knew that Stanley had the means to keep her there, but the question was whether he would allow her to leave willingly or if she was being held against her will. Elena, heartbroken and terrified, couldn't understand why Stanley had done this. He had always been so devoted to Rita, but now his actions seemed beyond comprehension. He had taken her away, isolating her in a secluded place, and all Elena could do was wait for any sign of life. Meanwhile, Stanley's increasingly erratic behavior became more evident. Friends and family who had once seen him as a devoted father began to realize that something far darker had taken root. It was clear now that his obsession with Rita had transformed into something far more dangerous. The search came to a heartbreaking conclusion 3 days later when police discovered the cabin. Inside, they found a chilling scene. Rita's lifeless body lay on the floor, with clear signs she had been suffocated. Her clothes were disheveled, and the room was eerily still. Nearby, Stanley's body was hanging from a makeshift noose, his final act one of despair and twisted devotion. The authorities quickly pieced together what had transpired, but the depth of the tragedy was difficult to comprehend. Stanley had taken his daughter to the cabin, away from the prying eyes of the world, and in his delusional obsession he believed that this would be the only way to keep her safe, to keep her for himself. In the letter found beside his body, Stanley expressed his distorted view of love. He wrote about the world's dangers, about how Rita would never truly be happy unless she stayed with him, away from the influences of everyone else. He mentioned his belief that he was protecting her from the cruelty of life, and that by ending their lives together, they would be free from the world's pressures. The note, written in a frantic scrawl, made no sense to anyone who read it. Stanley's once deep affection for his daughter had twisted into something unrecognizable, something that would end in this unspeakable act. Elena, who had been waiting anxiously at home for any word about her daughter, was shattered when the police arrived with the news. The devastation was overwhelming. In a single moment, her entire world collapsed. Her daughter, her precious Rita, was gone, taken not by some external force but by the very person who should have protected her the most. She couldn't fathom the idea that Stanley, the man she had spent her life with, had done this, had not only taken their daughter but had ended her life in the most cruel way. The community was left in shock, unable to understand how a father's love could have transformed into such a tragic obsession. Friends who had once admired Stanley for his devotion to his family now saw him as a monster. They recalled how protective he had been of Rita, how his presence had been constant in her life, but they never could have imagined it would end this way. The story of Stanley Carter and his tragic obsession with his daughter served as a haunting reminder of how a parent's love, when taken to extremes, can become a destructive force. Rita's bright future, her dreams, and her independence were all stolen by the one person who should have helped her grow. The town would never forget the horrifying end to a father's obsession, a chilling tale that left everyone questioning how something so devastating could happen in a place that seemed so safe.